The relationship between the Boondocks and the Peanuts sounds simple on the surface, but goes a long way at making sense of why the Boondocks focuses on the children and how it influenced the way it delivers its message. So to put it in some perspective, if Breft taught me how to be a cartoonist, Schulz taught me how to be a human being. If Watterson taught me how to tell a joke, Schulz taught me which jokes to tell. The Peanuts has always been so much more than a comic strip. These were my first life lessons. For those not in the know, The Peanuts was an old cartoon that ran back in the day and was known primarily for its TV specials. Well, before TV specials, there were comic strips. Oh, I read it, just not very often. Not since I was very young. By the 4th grade, I'd moved on to Garfield, and several years later, to the strip that would ultimately make me want to do this for the living, Bloom County. Shortly thereafter, I discovered the genius of Bill Watterson and Gary Trudeau. Aaron McGruder went on record several times stating that while he admired the Peanuts as a comic strip, his admiration with it started with the TV specials, going as far to state that this is what he wanted the Boondocks as a TV show to be like the Peanuts TV specials.
The daily strip and a weekly show, I thought that would be too much. Crazy me. I wanted to do like specials, like the Peanut specials, 2, 3 a year, or 1 a year. I go, that sounds like a nice. Television apparently doesn't work that way anymore.
He even goes as far to state that his legacy wasn't in the comic strips, but in the TV specials he produced. But like many people my age, my first exposure to Snoopy wasn't on the paper. It was on television. By the time I was old enough to read and understand that comics could be interesting and somewhat an amusing part of life, Snoopy and Charlie Brown had already become life.
I mean, there's Charles Schulz, but the reality is that the Peanuts actually just transcended the medium. It just became so much more than that. And, Charles Schulz's legacy is in more than his comic strip. It's actually in the TV shows, which I really like. The Christmas special and all that stuff. I mean,
the original Christmas special, along with The Great Pumpkin and several others, had captured my imagination somewhere after my first viewing of Star Wars, but way before my 4th birthday. Even though there were clear references to the Peanuts written within the Boondocks comic strip, it's not enough to argue that the comic strip's tone was dictated by it. The Boondocks leans more into Bloom County with its style there. But the main thing I want to communicate here is that Aaron had a real fondness for the Peanuts, and he spoke about how Snoopy Come Home would always make him cry, and how he owes the existence of the Boondocks to the Peanuts. So to put it into some perspective, if Breft taught me how to be a cartoonist, Schulz taught me how to be a human being. If Watterson taught me how to tell a joke, Schulz taught me which jokes to tell. The Peanuts has always been so much more than a comic strip. These were my first life lessons. But what voice could the Peanuts possibly have?
Here's the thing. Yeah, I mean, there are people who do this job because they love comic strips. And Bill Watterson was one of those people. Gary Trudeau is one of those people. Charles Schulz was obviously one of those people. They love the medium. They want to be cartoonists. Me, I really ain't a big fan of comic strips, to be honest. I like the voice. I like having the ability to say something. And this seemed like a way I could sort of sneak in and get a huge message out while nobody was looking, and it worked.
One of the biggest things the Peanuts does similarly to the Boondocks is that it takes the struggles and insecurities of adulthood and puts them on full display through the lens of children. One of my favorite examples of this in the Peanuts comes from 2011. Happiness is a Warm Blanket, Charlie Brown. This was a TV special, in my opinion, about addiction, about the things that people use and cling to in order to make sense of the world at large and cope with it. One of the characters can't do anything without a blanket, and Lucy gets frustrated because in her eyes, Linus is using the blanket as a crutch. She shames him for still claiming to need it, and go through an entire episode about his anxiety of life without it, trying to overcome it, and ultimately his spiral in trying to find it. Towards the end of the episode, when making a case for his need for it, he talks about adults and needing coffee in the morning or a glass of wine to get through a long day. Linus stands up towards the end of the episode and vents his frustrations about how people see his blanket, how everyone depends on something or someone to help them through life, and that there's nothing really wrong with that. I've always looked at this special being about addiction. This special is interesting because it's about how addiction can be very much perception, that everyone has their own vices and tools that they use to comfort themselves. For some people it's video games, for some people it's eating ice cream and watching movies, for some it's going to the gym and working out. The purpose of this analysis isn't to say that addiction isn't real, it's to say that people can be addicted to anything, and anything without moderation can be harmful. But there's nothing wrong with having something that helps you get through the day, so long as it isn't hurting everyone. This kind of storytelling, using the children as a parallel for a real-life issue, is the cornerstone of how the Boondocks operates. Instead of telling a story about cultural appropriation within a workspace, Aaron makes white people take credit for Riley's mural. He's shamed for putting his name on it, and his work is unceremoniously stolen when he doesn't. In this situation, Aaron is using Riley's frustration with defining himself in suburbia as a parallel for the real-life issue of black artists and creatives having their work stolen. Instead here, we see it through the lens of children, much like the Peanuts. When Huey is told he has full creative control over his play, only for executive meddling to get in the way of what he actually wants, it's using the Christmas play as a parallel for black writers and creatives being given the keys, but limited in what they can actually produce. The tone-deaf changing of Jesus' race in the play is an example of how simple executive decisions can completely fly in the face of what you're trying to do, and there's nothing you can really do about it. Also, Christmas is really commercial. The Peanuts has always been so much more than a comic strip. These were my first life lessons. Be down with the underdog, empathize with the victimized. Life isn't always fair. Christmas is too commercial. Most of your friends will laugh at you at the earliest opportunity. Girls will pull away at the last second and leave you screaming flat on your face. But above all else, keep your head up. These simple life lessons are relayed from the perspective of the children. And so long as the perspective is framed from that of the children, then the Boondocks is leaning into its Peanuts influences. And at least to me, that's part of what makes this series special. I remember being a kid and watching a show about Charles Schulz, and hearing him say that the odds of getting syndicated were several thousand to 1. I quickly wrote that off as a possible career choice, but occasionally I'd find myself looking at the Sunday Post wondering, if I did a strip, what would it look like? And how on earth could I do it every week? This was before I knew about daily comic strips. Such ponderings were the beginning of what would ultimately become the angriest cartoon ever created. With the Peanuts as a show, we see the parallel a lot better. An immediate dig is the music, Vince's compositions and iconic piano tunes and jingles. The Boondocks pilot, and by extension the first season, were trying to make each episode feel like a TV special. There's very overt examples of this, with episode titles imitating the Peanuts, like A Huey Freeman Christmas and It's a Black President, Huey Freeman. But even outside that framework, episode titles like The Story of Gangsterlicious, it all evokes a feeling that these stories are effectively these self-contained OVAs. Each episode of the show adheres to this in very differing ways, but the soundtrack plays a massive role into that. A big reason the Red Bull sticks out is because the backing track is unique to that episode. It's a Black President Huey Freeman has its own identity and voice in a season that's really fast-paced, in large part because of its unique background composition. Naturally, a unique composition isn't the key to an episode feeling special, but the fact that the Boondocks does it quite frequently is telling. The Boondocks leans on this voice from the Peanuts. A big reason being how, in the eyes of McGruder, he sees his insecurities through it. Growing up in suburbia, struggling with his own self-identification, one of the biggest things that sticks out to me is the loneliness involved in that. There are more parallels between both series we can make, but I think a majority of them can be attributed to its tone of voice. The Peanuts as a show was never afraid to dwell on that melancholy, to let the moment of sadness just sit, before returning us to the status quo once more. Sante explains in his introduction to The Peanuts Every Day, 1961 to 1965, it wasn't surprising then. Sante continues, that my father, an intelligent, capable man, who had been dealt a series of bad hands from life, poverty, war, a truncated education, should see himself reflected in Charlie Brown. Charles Schulz's comic strip boy spoke to the Amiga sense of dislocation, tough luck, and calamity. These moments are also what I think the Boondocks tries to replicate to varying degrees of success. Huey and Charlie Brown are played similar in some regard, in that we're supposed to sympathize with Charlie Brown's fears and frustrations, just as, to some extent, we're supposed to sympathize with and understand Huey's perspective. When you look at what happens with Charlie Brown in the specials, you can often find yourself going, it's sad that a child has to feel this way. When you watch what happens to Huey within the show, you go, it's sad that a black child has to feel this way. Berkeley Breath once said, a comic strip is great not simply in its ability to satirize, act silly or shock, but to hold up to the reader a mirror, through which he can gain insights into himself. How many of us saw our own insecurities in Charlie Brown? Charlie Brown never talks to the red-haired girl, the same way Huey can never get a ride. In fact, in the original Boondocks pilot, specifically the script, there was a big point made about how Huey struggled to talk to Jasmine, another parallel to Charlie Brown. Charlie Brown struggles to rally people together for the Christmas play, where Huey desperately tries to not end up like Charlie Brown, demanding respect throughout. The Boondocks carries its influences from Charlie Brown on its sleeve. But I don't think it has any interest in simply identifying as a blacker Peanuts. It's an eclectic mix of diverse influences, and while comic strip fans will no doubt categorize it as a bastard child of strips like Bloom County, The Peanuts, and Calvin and Hobbes, the Boondocks was not meant to simply recreate these funny classics in blackface. Its foundations, influences, and focus lay firmly at the cross-section of young black culture rarely seen, far away from the urban streets which usually serve as the backdrop for black youth. The Boondocks is a social and political commentary that focuses on the media's effect on young black people, and using that as a vehicle to ask questions about the society and world we're creating for young black people. The kids are forced to make an adjustment to suburban life, an essentially alien environment, with little more than one another for support. The story of these youngsters becomes symbolic of the interracial and intraracial experiences within America, a vehicle for social and cultural commentary, as well as an allegory for the young hip-hop generation struggling to find a place and identity in a larger world. The Boondocks is satire and silliness, drama and politics, and hip-hop. It is a mature look at the world and at ourselves through the innocent but nonetheless astute eyes of its young cast. I love Snoopy, and Charles, and Linus, and Lucy, and big up Franklin. I love Charles Schulz, and I'm sad to see him go. And I pray to whatever powers that be for his speedy recovery.